October 14, 1985, 8:42 p.m., Howard Beach, Queens, NY. The air in Queens smelled of salt from Jamaica Bay and the faint metallic scent of an oncoming storm. Inside the Gotti residence, the atmosphere was even heavier. John Gotti, the dapper Don, sat in his wingback leather chair, the amber liquid in his crystal glass catching the dim light of the chandelier. He wasn't moving. His chin was tilted slightly toward his chest, his eyes closed, his breathing heavy and rhythmic. To anyone else, he looked like a powerful man finally succumbing to the exhaustion of a day spent running the Gambino family. But John Gotti never truly slept, not when there was a stranger in his house. Across from him sat Anthony, a young man with polished shoes and a nervous habit of adjusting his tie. He was dating Victoria, Gotti's daughter. In the world of the five families, a father's approval wasn't just a blessing, it was a survival requirement. Anthony looked at the man who could order a hit as easily as a cup of espresso. He saw the stillness of the dawn. He heard the clock ticking on the mantel, a sharp, rhythmic click-clack that sounded like a countdown. Anthony's pulse thundered in his ears. He glanced toward the kitchen, hoping Victoria would return with the coffee, but the hallway remained dark. He was alone with a sleeping lion. Or was he? The moment of the test had begun. Gotti was practicing a psychological play he'd used on captains and associates for years, the feigned sleep. It was a vacuum of authority designed to see what a man does when he thinks no one is watching. Does he steal? Does he look through papers? Or does he show the kind of discipline that keeps a man alive in New York? To understand how Anthony ended up in this pressure cooker, we have to go back 3 months. Back to the neon-lit social clubs where loyalty was the only currency that didn't devalue. In this life, the error wasn't being afraid. The error was thinking the Don didn't know exactly how fast your heart was beating. July 19, 1985, 11:15 p.m., Ravenite Social Club, Mulberry Street. The heat in Little Italy was oppressive, the kind of humidity that made silk shirts stick to skin. Outside the Ravenite, men in dark suits leaned against Cadillacs, their eyes scanning the street with a practiced predatory indifference. Inside, John Gotti moved through the blue haze of cigar smoke like a king. He understood the architecture of power. It wasn't built on violence alone, but on the management of perception. A man who can't control his own house can't control a street corner, Gotti had told his brother Gene that night. He was obsessed with the details. If a soldier's shoes weren't shined, he was sloppy. If he talked too much, he was a risk. When Victoria started mentioning Anthony's name, Gotti didn't get angry. He got curious. He began a silent investigation that would make the FBI's surveillance teams look like amateurs. Anthony was a civilian, or so he seemed. He worked in construction. Real construction, not the mob-managed kind. He had no record. But in Gotti's world, clean often meant hidden. The Don had seen men use his children as ladders to reach the inner sanctum of the Gambino Empire. He wouldn't let that happen to Victoria. Back in the present, in the quiet of the Queen's living room, Anthony reached for his glass of water. His hand trembled. He looked at Gotti's desk just 3 feet away. A manila envelope sat near the edge. It was thick, stuffed with papers that likely decided the fate of unions, ports, and men. The temptation to peek, to see the world behind the curtain, was a siren song. Anthony's shadow flickered against the wall as he leaned forward. The theme of the night was entrapment. In the mafia, the most dangerous traps aren't made of steel. They are made of silence and opportunity. Anthony's fingers hovered inches from the desk. He could hear the distant siren of an NYPD cruiser blocks away, a reminder of the world outside this fortress. He looked at Gotti's face, still motionless. The domed chest rose and fell. He didn't know that Gotti's sleep was a mirror, and Anthony was about to show his true reflection. 6 weeks earlier, Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, Ozone Park. The smell of espresso and stale smoke permeated the Bergen. Gotti was holding court, but his mind was on the report his associates had brought him regarding Anthony. "The kid's a ghost, John," Angelo Ruggiero had whispered. "No debts, no side hustles, just works and goes home. Maybe he's just a nice kid." Gotti had smirked, a sharp, cold expression. "Nobody is just a nice kid in New York. Everyone wants something. especially when they're sitting at my dinner table. He knew that his reputation preceded him, and he used it as a tool. He wanted Anthony to be terrified. Terror reveals the cracks in a man's character. If Anthony was a coward, he'd flee. If he was a shark, he'd try to find an advantage. If he was a spy, he'd look for information. Back in the Queen's living room, Anthony pulled his hand back from the desk. He didn't touch the envelope. Instead, he did something Gotti didn't expect. He stood up quietly, walked over to the window, and closed the blinds slightly to block the glare of a street lamp that was hitting the Don's face. It was a gesture of care? Or was it a tactical move to ensure they weren't being watched from the street? Gotti, through the slit of his eyelids, noted the movement. He's protecting the perimeter, Gotti thought, or he's making sure no one sees what happens next. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Anthony sat back down, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the door where Victoria had disappeared. He was waiting. But in this house, waiting was an art form. The don't breathing changed slightly, a deeper rattle in the throat. To the untrained ear, it was a heavy sleep. To a hitman, it was a signal. The decision Anthony faced was simple: treat the Don as a father, or treat him as a target. September 3rd, 1985. 02:14 a.m., an alleyway behind a Brooklyn diner. To understand the stakes, one must understand what happened to the last man who tried to play John Gotti. His name was Louis, a low-level associate who thought he could skim from the top while Gotti was distracted by the feds. Gotti had invited him to a quiet dinner. By the end of the night, Louis wasn't just out of the business, he was out of existence. Loyalty isn't a word, Gotti had said, as he watched the taillights of a car disappear into the night. It's a series of actions when you think you're safe. The story of Gotti's ruthlessness was the fuel that ran the Gambino engine, and Anthony was now the smallest cog in that engine. In the living room, a floorboard creaked. It wasn't Anthony. It was the house settling, or perhaps one of Gotti's security detail moving in the shadows of the hallway. Anthony froze. He looked at the Don. Gotti's hand, resting on the arm of the chair, twitched. His pinky ring, a massive diamond that signaled his status, glinted in the dark. Anthony whispered, "Mr. Gotti?" No response. Anthony leaned in closer. He could smell the Don's cologne, expensive, masculine, overwhelming. He noticed a small piece of lint on Gotti's lapel. It was an imperfection on a man who demanded perfection. Anthony reached out. His fingers were inches from Gotti's chest. If a guard walked in now, it would look like an assassination attempt. If Gotti opened his eyes, it would look like an assault. The consequence of a single touch could be a life sentence in a shallow grave in the Jersey Pine Barrens. Anthony's fingers brushed the fabric. Gotti's eyes didn't open, but his hand suddenly gripped the arm of the chair with white-knuckled force. The present, the Gotti residence. The click wasn't a gun. It was the sound of Gotti's lighter on the side table, knocked over by Anthony's sleeve as he reached for the lint. The metal hit the floor with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil in the silent room. Anthony gasped, recoiling. He stared at the Don, expecting the explosion, expecting the men in the shadows to swarm, but Gotti remained asleep. The Don was impressed. The kid hadn't reached for the wallet. He hadn't reached for the gun Gotti kept tucked into the side of the cushion. He had reached for lint. It was either the most brilliant act of subservience Gotti had ever seen, or the kid was genuinely, hopelessly civilian. He didn't sit back down. He walked toward the back of the room, toward the heavy oak cabinet where Gotti kept his private collection of brandy. He opened the door. The hinges gave a soft, rhythmic moan. Anthony didn't look back. He reached inside and pulled out a bottle. Gotti's mind raced. Here it is. The theft. The disrespect. He prepared to wake up and end the charade with a display of violence that would be talked about for decades. He waited for the sound of liquid pouring into a glass. Instead, he heard the sound of a cap being screwed tighter. Anthony had noticed the bottle wasn't sealed properly. The fumes were evaporating, ruining the expensive liquor. He tightened it, wiped a smudge off the glass with his thumb and placed it back exactly where it was. Every move Anthony made was being analyzed by a man who saw the world as a series of threats and opportunities. Anthony was choosing respect over ego, but the test wasn't over. The final stage of Gotti's trap was about to be sprung. 10 minutes into the sleep. Suddenly, the phone on the side table began to ring. It was the red line, the one only used for emergencies. In the 80s, a ringing phone was a physical intrusion. Anthony looked at the phone. He looked at Gotti. If he answered it, he was overstepping his bounds. If he let it ring, he might be ignoring a warning that could save Gotti's life. The ringing was shrill, piercing the urban silence of the house. Ring, ring, ring. Anthony stood up. He walked to the phone. He looked at Gotti's sleeping face. He knew who this man was. Everyone in New York knew. He knew that answering this phone could be his death warrant. "Don't do it, kid," Gotti thought behind his mask of sleep. "Don't touch the business." Anthony's hand gripped the receiver, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he placed his hand over the bell housing to muffle the sound, shielding the sleeping Don from the noise. He stood there, vibrating with tension, as the phone rang 5, 6, 7 times. He was protecting the Don's rest. Gotti felt a strange sensation, one he hadn't felt in years. It was a flicker of genuine trust. But in the Gambino family, trust was a weakness. He had to be sure. He had to push Anthony to the breaking point. The phone stopped ringing. Silence returned, thicker than before. Then Anthony heard the front door open. It wasn't Victoria. It was the sound of heavy boots. 2 men entered the foyer, Gotti's primary bodyguards. They saw Anthony standing over the Don, hand still on the phone. "What the hell are you doing?" one of them growled, his hand moving toward his waistband. Anthony froze. The guards, Frank and Sal, were the personification of the Gambino muscle. They didn't see a boyfriend. They saw a threat. He was sleeping," Anthony stammered, his voice cracking. The phone was loud. "I didn't want to wake him." Sal stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Step away from him, now." Anthony backed away, hitting the edge of the brandy cabinet. He looked at Gotti, pleading with his eyes for the man to wake up and end this. But Gotti remained a statue. He was committed to the play. He wanted to see how Anthony handled the wolves. "You think you're part of the family already, kid?" Frank sneered, poking a finger into Anthony's chest. "You think you can touch his things, protect his sleep?" Anthony's fear was being replaced by a flicker of something else. Dignity. He was a construction worker from Queens. He wasn't a gangster, but he wasn't a dog. "I was being respectful," Anthony said, his voice steadier now. "If you guys were doing your job, you would have muffled the phone yourselves." The air in the room ionized. The guards looked at each other. No one talked to them like that, especially not a civilian in the Don's house. Sal pulled his piece, a snub-nosed .38, just enough for Anthony to see the steel. "Say that again," Sal whispered. This was the decision point. Anthony could beg. He could cry, or he could stand his ground. "I said," Anthony repeated, his heart hammering against his ribs, "he's a man who deserves peace, even from you." Gotti's heart swelled. The kid has stones. 23:02 p.m., the Gotti residence. Gotti stirred. He let out a long, theatrical yawn and opened his eyes slowly, as if coming back from a deep, peaceful slumber. He looked at the scene, his guards with their hands on their weapons, and Anthony, pale but standing tall. "What's the noise?" Gotti asked, his voice a gravelly rumble that commanded the room. "Boss," Sal said, quickly tucking his gun away. "The kid was... We caught him hovering over the phone. We thought..." Gotti raised a hand. The room went silent. The legend was back in control. He looked at Anthony for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at the lint-free lapel. He looked at the sealed brandy bottle. "Anthony," Gotti said, "come here." Anthony approached, feeling like he was walking toward a guillotine. Gotti stood up, adjusting his silk tie. He was taller than he looked in the chair. He radiated power. "You muffled the phone," Gotti said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "You fixed my bottle." "Yes, sir." "And you told my boys they were incompetent." Anthony swallowed hard. I just thought..." Gotti leaned in, his face inches from Anthony's. The smell of tobacco and power was overwhelming. He reached out and grabbed Anthony's shoulder. The grip was like a vice. Anthony closed his eyes, waiting for the blow. 23:15 p.m. The kitchen. Instead of a punch, Gotti patted Anthony's shoulder twice. "You're a good boy, Anthony. You have something most of these guys lose after a week on the street. You have a sense of order." Gotti turned to his guards. "Go wait in the car. You're making the guest nervous." As the guards slunk out, Victoria finally entered with the coffee. She saw the two men standing together. "Is everything okay?" she asked, sensing the lingering electricity in the room. "Everything is fine, sweetheart," Gotti said, his voice suddenly warm, the voice of a loving father. "Anthony was just telling me about his work. He's a builder. We need more builders in this world. Too many people just know how to tear things down." They sat for coffee. Gotti had tested Anthony, but the test had a secondary purpose. He now knew that Anthony could be trusted with a secret. And in Gotti's world, trust was the first step toward recruitment. Over the next hour, Gotti didn't talk about crime. He talked about family. He talked about loyalty. He spoke in parables that Anthony didn't fully understand yet, but the theme was clear. Power is a burden and only the disciplined can carry it. "The error wasn't trying to help," Gotti told him as he walked him to the door. "The error was thinking I wouldn't notice. Always remember, Anthony, in this house even the wolves are awake." Anthony walked out into the cool Queen's night, his shirt soaked with sweat, feeling like he had just survived a car crash. He had passed the Don's test, but he didn't realize that by passing, he had just entered a cage far more dangerous than the one he had feared. 1 week later, a local construction site. Anthony was back at work, but everything was different. A black Cadillac sat at the edge of the site. Men in suits watched him from a distance. He was no longer just a civilian. He was the kid who stood up to Sal. The story had spread. The legend had grown. John Gotti had pretended to be asleep to test a daughter's boyfriend, but the result was a permanent mark on Anthony's life. He had gained the Don's respect, but in New York the Don's respect was a golden handcuff. He was now under the protection of the Gambino family, whether he wanted it or not. The theme of reputation had come full circle. Anthony had protected Gotti's peace, and now Gotti would protect Anthony's future. Every promotion he got, every contract his company won, he would wonder, is this because of me, or because of the man in the wingback chair? The moral was clear. In the shadow of a legend, there is no such thing as a normal life. You either become part of the story, or the story consumes you. John Gotti sat in his chair that night, eyes closed again. He wasn't testing anyone this time. He was just savoring the silence. He had found a man of character, and in his world, a man of character was the most valuable asset of all. Would you have risked touching the Don's belongings just to show respect, or would you have stayed paralyzed by fear? Leave a like, subscribe for more underworld stories, and comment below. Is gaining the Don's respect worth the risk of being pulled into the mafia?